Jeff Kinley, you were one of the first names I thought of over the weekend when this invasion from Hamas into Israel unfolded for a variety of reasons. But as a prophecy expert, and I just want to mention this, we're going to get into it after, you host a great show called Prophecy Pros Podcast. You also have a litany of books, but the latest is God's Grand Finale, where you talk about a lot of these end times themes. But as a prophecy expert, what has been going through your mind since seeing the news on Saturday morning?
Well, I'd just say this. We were scheduled to fly into Tel Aviv and right this moment that you and I are speaking. So that was the first thing on my mind is that, God's timing and just protecting us from getting there. But I think to me, Billy, it's really just confirmation that we're living in the last days. I mean, the Bible prophesies so much about Israel, conflict in Israel, wars and rumors of wars that are going to take place, earthquakes that are happening right now. All these things that are happening are the precursors, I believe, to the actual end times events that we see in Revelation chapter 6 through 18. So in my mind, it's just more confirmation that we're living in very volatile times, but times that are very prophetic as well.
Yeah. And there are a lot of people right now who are watching this and they're curious. They want to understand the history. And we're going to get into a little bit of that. We can't tackle all of it. It's a very deep and long history, but about this land, about this area, about this conflict. What do you say to those who they watch these events and they say, oh, there's always conflict. There's always things going on. This has nothing to do with the end times. They just sort of, not that this definitively does, but they just sort of dismiss it outright. What do you say to those people?
Well, I'll just say this, that all the events in the past 2,000 years have been in the context where there hasn't been a nation Israel. And now that there is a nation, they're in the land, there's been nothing but conflict since then because Satan and those surrounding nations do not want them to occupy the land that God promised to Abraham. And so there's been constant conflict. I mean, Satan is very territorial. And God promised that land to Abraham. And so I think that's one of the things that really is a telltale sign. It's like this, Billy. I say that when your check engine light comes on in your car, you really need to pay attention to that. Well, God's flashing the check engine light on history and on the nations right now, and particularly Israel. So we do need to pay attention to it.
Yeah. And, we can't get into every event, but there's such a complex history. But there are a couple of bookend events in recent history, and you just sort of mentioned one of them is distant history. It's AD 70 and the siege of Jerusalem, and this is when Rome came in. Let's talk about that event in 70 AD because it was a really defining event for Jerusalem and for the Jewish people. Can you take us through what happened in the year 70?
Yeah, basically, Rome sent the General Titus into Jerusalem. He laid siege to Jerusalem for many months, eventually conquering Jerusalem and the Temple Mount. He burned the temple, as Jesus declared in Matthew 24. Not one stone was left upon another. You can go there today and see the remnants of that. But that basically caused the Jews to be expelled from that area. There were about 10,000 that were slaughtered immediately right there on the spot. And then in 135 AD, all the Jews were basically banned and banished from the land. So it was a very significant event, Billy, because what that did was that ended up dovetailing into 2,000 years of history of the Jews being scattered to some 70 nations all across the world. So the fact that the Jews would come back to their land after 20 centuries being scattered to 70 nations is really the miracle on the Mediterranean, as it's been called. And no other people group has ever done that in history. And yet it happened to the Jews just as God predicted.
And it happened not all that long ago. We go to this other bookend event. I mentioned there were two. We talked about 70, jumping ahead to 1948 when Israel comes back on the map. And this was a monumental event. Talk a little bit about the significance of this. You just spoke to it a little bit, but, there were a lot of people waiting for this event. Some thought it would never happen. And yet 1948.
Yeah, well, God had predicted this several times. In fact, it's been said that every Old Testament prophet besides Jonah in some way predicts the regathering of the Jews back to the Holy Land. The reason why this is so significant is as we look to the end times prophecies that in the book of Revelation and Daniel, even in 2 Thessalonians and Paul and 1 John with the Antichrist, none of these prophecies can really take place unless Israel's in the land. So you sort of have a step one and a step two. Well, step one has to be Israel being a nation again. And then step two can happen, which is all the end times prophecies. So the precursor for these prophecies happening is the Jewish people being back in the land. And up to half of the Jews in the whole world now are back into Israel. Again, that's just a supernatural gathering together that simply cannot be denied.
Yeah, and I want to talk a little bit more and a little bit about that because, again, a lot of time passed in between there, and there were probably times that people thought, how can any of this possibly happen? Because it's not making any sense. The events aren't lining up, and yet here we are where the events are now lined up. But talking about the Old Testament in particular, when it comes to 1948, you mentioned lots of conversation and prophecy in the Old Testament. What do you find to be the most compelling and interesting prophecy there in the Old Testament when it comes to that regathering of Israel?
Well, it's just the fact that the Jewish people had a relationship with God, the nation of Israel, rather. And God told them, if you obey me, then I'll protect you. Everything will be fine. But if you disobey me, I will scatter you to the nations. So once again, we have the apologetic or the credibility of the word of God. I mean, everything God has said about the Jewish people in the Old Testament will come true and has come true, including this regathering. Another thing that he says, though, in the Old Testament is that first they're regathered physically as a nation, but then they're going to be awakened or born again, if you will, spiritually as well at the end of the tribulation period. I love what the book of Isaiah says in Isaiah chapter 66 and verse 8 says, "Who has heard of such a thing? Who has seen such a thing? Can a nation be born in a day? Can a nation be brought forth all at once?" And of course, in one day, May 14th, 1948, it all came together. So it really ought to cause us in a day, Billy, when none of us are really wowed or amazed at anything. This should amaze us that these ancient prophecies have come true in modern times, and we can watch it in real time happening.
I mean, if you were to get a statistician in here to say, hey, here are the chances that this country from 1900 years ago that's been off the map would come back on the map at any point, it would almost be 0%, essentially, the chances of that. And yet these events are happening. And this current conflict is part of this land conflict. And also there's definitely, obviously, a spiritual element to this, but this conflict that has been going on for decades now, the modern version of it. But, Ezekiel, I want to read Ezekiel 36:24 because I find this really compelling. It says, "For I will take you out of the nations, I will gather you from all the countries and bring you back into your own land." And you read scriptures like that written thousands of years before 1948. Now, there may be some people who say, no, that's referring to something else, another event that already happened. Is there any other event that could be referring to?
No, there's literally nothing. And you can trace through all of history in the past 2,000 years since the Jews were expelled from the land. And we can't find anything in history that even remotely comes close. Now, there was in the 19th century, the Zionist movement that began sort of a gradual trickle back into the land, but the land was just unproductive. It was full of malaria and weeds, and there were no trees in the land because trees were taxed. And so it was just a desolate place. But in the grand sovereignty of the way that God does things, God used the Holocaust and to create really a sympathy worldwide for the Jewish people. And that contributed to her being able to be declared a state once again on May 14th, 1948. So you really can't find anything else, but May 14th really becomes that birthday, if you will, the modern birthday of the nation Israel.
Israel's modern story officially began on May 14th, 1948. When Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion declared the country's independence in a small Tel Aviv building. Just a few hours later, the United States under President Harry Truman became the first country to recognize Israel.
The United States recognizes the provisional government as the de facto authority of the new state of Israel.
Historian Michael Oren says Truman's faith helped him defy his advisors' strong objections and support Israel's statehood.
He could recite large passages from the Bible. He knew the map of Palestine better than he knew the map of his neighboring county in Missouri. And he had been a member of a evangelical committee when he was a senator called the American Christian Committee for Palestine, which was pro-Zionist.
Immediately, doors opened to thousands of Holocaust survivors who had lost everything. A nation miraculously born in a day now would give them a homeland.
In the whole history of the world, no people, no country has ever gone out of existence for anything like 2,000 years and then been reborn. So it is correct to say that it's a miracle, but that is the dramatic understatement. because the rebirth of Israel is a whole series of miracles.
Israel would need many miracles just to survive the day after statehood. Arab armies attacked from all sides. Trained by the British and much better armed, they vowed to push the Jews into the sea. That caused many of the new Jewish refugees to become instant soldiers.
Many of them got off on the docks and they had weapons thrust into their hands and were told, "Welcome to Israel, you are now fighting for her survival, and by the way, yours is kind of on the line too."
These tanks and trucks, decorated with wreaths, are the actual vehicles from the 1948 Battle of Latrun, a key battle to break the siege of Jerusalem and help Israel survive its first war as a modern nation. Fight for Jerusalem was intense, and although the Jewish residents of the old city would be forced to lose their homes, they helped Israel survive the early days of the war. In its 60 years, Israel has fought 3 more wars on its own soil and 2 more in Lebanon. And today's radical Islamists share the same goal as Israel's Arab foes in 1948, to put an end to its existence. Historian Paul Johnson believes supernatural timing is part of Israel's creation, which is marked by many Arabs and Muslims as a catastrophe, and by Israel's supporters as a source of celebration.
The truth is, in asking for their independence and for a national home, the Jews were about 10 to 15 years ahead of the Arabs. If they'd been running neck and neck, they'd have never have got it, in my opinion. So they stepped through a window of history which suddenly opened briefly into nationhood, and it is one of the miracles of history that this happened.
Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.